Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of AMA's Marketing Ed. I'm your host, AMA CEO Bennie F. Johnson. In our episodes, we explore life through a marketing lens, delving into the conversations with individuals that flourish at this intersection of marketing and the unexpected. We'll introduce you to visionaries whose stories you might not yet have heard of, but are exactly the ones you need to know. Through thought-provoking conversations, we'll unravel the challenges, triumphs, and pivotal moments that have been shaped by marketing. Today, we have a really special guest, none other than Ries. Laura is a globally recognized marketing strategist and best-selling author. Since 2022, she's continued her father's legacy as chairwoman of Ries, guiding the expansion and global influence of the firm, where she has helped Fortune 500s and ambitious startups win through bold, focused brand positioning over the last 30 years. She's a much sought after speaker. We're really honored to have her join us on the podcast, the trusted advisor and author of the recently released Strategic Enemy, her new book that helps brands of any size build a position and business worth fighting for. Laura, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Oh my goodness. So I am excited that we have you. I think the book hasn't even been out for a week as of this recording. So, the fact that you chose to hang out with us for a little while is really powerful. So we're going to jump right in. The Strategic Enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So what brings us to this provocative title and the work that you're doing at this moment?
Well, as you know, my legacy is about positioning, and positioning is about owning an idea in the mind of the consumer. Yet what we found was the best way to make that positioning clear was to contrast it with an enemy. An enemy is an oppositional force that your brand or your category stands against. Now, it could be a competitor, but it could also be another category, a convention, a concept. It just has to be something you're not, something you're willing to say no to.
Right.
And stand against.
Oh, it's kind of powerful. I think back to music analogies and something. I'm stuck with Miles Davis quote with the notes you don't play are just as important as the ones you do.
Absolutely. And so much. And listen, I love to be here. The American Marketing Association, these are my peeps, right? And we're all in this together to build strong brands. Yet too often companies, first of all, they're entirely focused on themselves and trying to communicate that they're better than everyone. But really the exciting thing is to be able to contrast with the strategic enemy, how you're different, making that, simple distinction and clarity that helps people choose your brand over others. There's always a choice, and it's not about the enemy being wrong. It's about the enemy being different. And, there's multiple, strokes for different folks, right?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you talk about this as creating brands, businesses, and ideas that are worth fighting for.
Yes.
Right? We all get up and do the work that we do for a reason, right? Because we care deeply. And I think it's interesting from your point, so many times in companies, we'll see organizations and teams that are playing not to lose, which is very different than playing to win.
That's true. And it comes from, very important. You have already mentioned it, saying no to something.
Right.
That does set up what what line are you willing to put down in the sand? And what are you willing to get up and say, we are against that? And, most companies are afraid to do that, right? And they want to play it safe. Yet the biggest successors are those that are bold enough to stand against something. You look at the huge success of Liquid Death. And it was the packaging and, the craziness for it was canned water that stood against plastic bottles killing our environment. That was a very strong enemy to rally them, rally for, right? To save and to say against plastic bottles, or even, it can be the previous category. So you see the success of Dude Wipes, right? So they're, the pioneers of these wet, moist toilet papers with a great branding, but going up against saying dry toilet paper just doesn't cut it.
Right.
What's interesting is, the traditional companies came up with the product, right? It was Charmin and Cottonelle had this on the market for years, but they could never strongly position for it because
Right.
it would go against their own brand, right? They were line extensions. And that's the real danger. That's the real strategic enemy of good positioning these days, is having the line extension name on multiple categories that dilutes and diminishes your power and
Right.
strength and focus and ability to have that strategic enemy.
Let's talk a bit about how strategies evolve over years, because there was a time when the strategy was the brand extension.
Mm,
Like, put my logo and colors on anything else that's loosely or sometimes not even adjacent,
yeah.
connected to the work as a strategy, versus today, like honing in on that real authentic space that you can build a product on. Because you could say the product was invented, it
Yeah.
existed,
Yeah.
but no one bought it.
Well, because no one was able to really leverage and position and sell it to us to
Right,
get us
right.
excited about, because I mean, the name itself, even Dude Wipes, I mean, that's a strong, powerful name. And listen, it's just as appealing to women as it is to men, I tell you, because, you do a number two, you need a strong thing to clean it up.
Well,
But it is true that, line extension was, a big thing. You had GE, was the GE name was on everything. The
right,
IBM name was on everything. And you go back to Sony. Sony put its brand name on everything. In fact, most of the Japanese companies did. But the issue is competition.
right,
In a world with massive competing against, focused brands with strong positioning, strong ideas, becomes even more difficult to face them.
mhm,
And back, before we had the internet,
mhm,
if you had distribution power, perhaps you could be safe, right? You could
right,
control the shelf. But these days, with a phone and all the distribution outlets, it's just not possible. And you're likely to face someone with, a better strategy, and your weakened line extension strategy is going to be very vulnerable. And even, Coca-Cola, I mean, they've looked at things like, remember the brand Coca-Cola Life, and they had Coca-Cola Energy and Coca-Cola coffee brands. Forget it. I mean, they were trying to jump into new categories with a line extension instead of what should companies do? They should launch new brands and new categories. Because
right,
listen, the category is more important than the brand. People think, it's the Red Bull brand that's so important. No, it's not. It's the category they invented, the energy drink. And that name is how we verbalize the category.
right,
And that is, so you might think. And so you can't fall too much in love with your own brand.
right,
You have to see that, it is the category. Dominating the category is a powerful place. And if you see a new category, it's best to approach that with a new brand that can stand for that new category, and
right,
perhaps even be, your own enemy. I mean,
right,
Mike's Hard Lemonade is a great example. I mean, that brand was, a rising star of the early 2000s, an alternative to beer. It was sweet and delicious, right? But then people realized how much sugar was in those suckers. I mean, it was almost as much as a Coke, and it had a ton of calories and carbs and everything else.
right.
And, what do you do at that point where, new categories are taking off? And they did something very smart. They launched a new
Mm,
brand in a new category called hard seltzer, and they called it White Claw. And today, that's a billion-dollar business, the
right,
strongest brand in their portfolio.
right. It's so true. I remember once being on a tour at Starbucks headquarters, and everything is branded Starbucks. You come in, it feels the experience, the
Mm,
conversation, and the tour was all about the main Starbucks brand. And that gives a little bit of the story, the main Starbucks brand. I
yeah.
remember turning a corner, and then there was this brightly lit space that was completely different in space, and it was Seattle's Best. And I
Mm.
remember a brand leader looking at me and said, Seattle's Best competes in places where Starbucks can't and shouldn't.
And
And-
won't,
Right,
smartly.
exactly. It was this great juxtaposition, and it was all about this category in space, but they had unique voices, unique relationships, and unique offerings that really reinforce the brands.
It's a brilliant strategy. And instead of, doing Starbucks cheap, right? They did Seattle's Best, and in a sense competed with themselves, but they're very clearly differentiated. And someone was going to fill that space with a brand. It might as well be you,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that allows you to keep Starbucks at the premium, and puts then Seattle's Best and the Other places you don't want your brand. A very strong strategy that too many companies miss. And yet there's so many great examples like the one you just mentioned, but think back to what Toyota did with Lexus, right?
Right.
I mean, and the same thing happened with Hyundai, right? And the Genesis. Initially, they tried to put the Hyundai name on the Genesis car. Forget about it. Who's going to pay twice as much and have it still say Hyundai? I wanted to say Genesis, a new
Right.
brand, positioned at the high end of the category. Yet time and again, I think, at big companies, it's so hard not to use our name on everything.
Right.
They feel very loyal to the company. It's a little like, Dale Carnegie said, the person's name is the sweetest sound that you've ever heard. And I think
Right.
at a company, it's the same. You feel flattered when you hear it, and you think the brand name is the power. It's not. That the power lies in that category. And listen, you'll live or die on the category. Kodak, for example. I mean,
Right.
Kodak was absolutely one of the most powerful brands in the world. People thought it stood for quality or trust. No, it didn't. It stood for film photography. And when that went down, so did the brand.
Right. That is so true. Now, I'm curious about this. You talk about in your bio that you've helped Fortune 500 companies and ambitious startups. So
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that the nouns are important, but the adjectives really matter. So when we think about it, the framing of startups being ambitious, what's that tension like between assisting Fortune 5s who've achieved a level of financial success and gravitas
Mhm.
versus startups, which by definition are knocking at the door?
Startups and entrepreneurs are fun because they are willing to be bold and take chances, right?
Mm,
They see the opportunity and they very strongly usually want to go up against something. The David
right,
and Goliath, they're trying to fight to change something. With the big companies, they're much more risk averse, right?
right,
They don't like to make too many changes. And sometimes some of the recommendations, very hard for them to swallow. Launching a new brand in a new category, for example. I mean, a big company isn't always set up to handle that correctly.
right,
And it can be very challenging for them. It seems like an easier short term win, perhaps, to do the line extension versus the long term game of, launching that new brand. So, but it is, working for me and my career of worked so many different companies, a strong, different industries around the world, as a matter of fact,
right,
very clear to see how the similarities exist because it's all about the mind of the consumer.
right,
It's not whether it's from a big company or a small company. Consumers don't care. They don't really think about that. Is what does the brand stand for? What are you positioning yourself as? What is that, and what is the other choices I have out there to
right.
make? Why should I pick you? I mean, that's what it's all about.
And in many cases, the smaller the company, the more endeared they are to our space. The
Yeah.
sense of, right? The sense of, you think about how many large companies spend their marketing efforts to be more in touch, more personal, more intimate, to be smaller, right? To get closer.
Mm,
And then the smaller brands that we see that may be regional plays or community plays,
mhm.
that really attract people in.
Well, and two, having, when you have the founder involved, right? You
Right,
have the birth story. You have these early employees who are really passionate about the
right,
cause and the mission and all of these things. And so there's just a tremendous energy. And the founder, CEO is so incredibly important because today you can't succeed without good marketing. I mean, of
right,
course, you need a product, you need a service, but you also need the marketing along with it. You need the spokesperson that is going to go out and talk about it and sell it and communicate it in a strong, focused way. And lastly, I mean, let's not, the visual opportunity. I call it the visual hammer, a way to visualize your positioning strategy to make it memorable, to make it distinctive is super, super important. And adding on, of course, pioneering a new category is a way to build a brand, but combining it with a visual hammer difference is
mhm,
the way for long-term success. You think about the blue box of Tiffany's, right? I
right,
mean, what an iconic color box system that just hammers that idea in the mind.
right.
But, if you go back, do you know what they were first in?
What?
They're first in the raised prong diamond engagement ring. Before Tiffany's, everything was bezel set. It was, flat. That was safer, right? You don't want to lose the diamond. But they engineered through,
Right,
found a way to make it raised, which of course makes it beautiful. And that really got a lot of PR and a lot of attention. And then they wisely also packaged it in that blue box, which became just as coveted as the ring
right.
itself.
we talk about kind of the power and impact of color and making things memorable. So we're
Uh,
going to go a little bit down memory lane. Think back. What was your first brand client with your dad?
oh, geez. It's been a long time.
Not that long, but I'm interested in how we start, right? And so, what
Yeah.
was the first brand client that you all worked on together?
Yeah, well, so we started in 1994. So I went to Northwestern University and I worked then for a year at TBWA Advertising.
Okay.
I was on Evian and Willite, and it was fun, but I was like, my biggest opportunity, I mean, to learn from the very best there was, Ries. So,
Yeah.
we got together, and yeah, one of the first clients was Ely Coffee, and
Okay.
the guys flew over from Milano, and this was an unheard of brand in the US at that time, and actually very small globally as well. And it is a family business, and they came over. I mean, the suits were, oh my gosh, so they were very, very well styled as Milano businessmen, you can imagine. But they were trying to, how do we position Ely globally as a company? And it was really a very exciting project. And we actually did and still stay in touch with them actually to this day, such a great company. But that, what did Ely have? What did they focus on? And they were espresso.
Mm,
Espresso,
mhm.
not coffee. Because in Italy, everyone drinks just the little espressos. And so the espresso, and they had a very unique idea. Instead of single source of their beans, they perfected this well balanced. They took the beans from everywhere and they
Mm,
made the best blend. There was only one. Starbucks had a million, all the coffee shops had all sorts of different single this and that. But
right.
they had one blend, and that was a very powerful idea. And working on them, with that, and of course their red iconic color was, so terrific. We even thought, well, how about you had red cups for
Right.
the restaurants, because it was mainly, as at the high end restaurants, they were all serving Ely coffee, Ely espresso, I should say.
Very nice. And so, what's your most recent client?
My most recent client, well, yeah, we're always working, but we worked with, and I talk a little bit about in the book, but Southworks, I've
Okay.
worked with them several times, and this is a smaller entrepreneurial type company. They do software development, and their difference, and in working on what was their strategic enemy. They were competing with lots of companies, big companies,
Mm,
small
mhm.
companies, but their key difference is, and their strategic enemy were the companies in India and Eastern Europe. A lot of software development over in these areas. Their difference was they were in South America. And so, but they weren't promoting it actually. They were trying to look global, as many of us do, right? You're a small company, so you want to look like you're everywhere and doing everything. Narrow the focus. Of course, they had the name Southworks, but they didn't reinforce the idea. So we gave them a visual of the map of South America. One of the funny comments is after they had used it, not everyone apparently recognizes the map of South America, but that's their problem. We're going to have to teach
Right,
the
right.
world how
The
to read
global
a
map.
map. So some thought it was Africa. They weren't quite sure, but it is South America. But being in the same time zone. In addition to that, their narrowly focused idea and category idea was development on demand instead of the
Right.
long-term contracts. None of the hassles, none of the overhead, none of the do-overs. The short-term on-demand contracts to get what you need done right away, right on time, with the best developers there are.
Now, when you're working with groups, I love for our audience, they're probably wondering, how do I craft a noble strategic enemy? How do
Mm,
I craft one that's going to resonate and push us to our
mhm.
best? Like we said, we have some market areas where we represent this and they represent that, and it's really clean and easy. But in our complex world, I think some of the value comes from these unexpected strategic enemies. How would you counsel folks to craft one that's noble enough?
I don't know if I would say noble is the word, but it just has to
Uh-huh.
be a clear, potentially even visual difference, right? So
Right.
it's got to be instantly accepted. It can't be something you have to explain in detail in a
Right.
50
Right.
slide PowerPoint, right? It's got to be instantly accepted and clear. And so, in thinking about, what are the challenges out there, right? What is, are we going up against the norm or the the convention? Are we doing it a different way? What are we up? What are we doing? And who else is out there doing something else? One example I love is the farmer's dog. So, we're all treating our pets better and buying them fancier clothes and better food. And so this is, healthier food for
Right. Right.
dogs. But they just didn't, talk about why they're better and talk about the quality of their food. They said, what are we fighting against? What do you got to stop doing before you're going to
Right.
buy our food? And that was dry dog food, and they called it burnt brown balls. That's a way to reposition your competition, believe me.
There you go.
And I bought. We stopped buying canned dog food in the store decades ago because I thought the dry food was healthier. But now, they're telling it's overly processed. Highly processed food is not good for you to eat every day. Why are you feeding that to your dog? You're going to shorten their life. And
Mhm.
that's where you make that emotional connection. And that then they leverage, long live dogs as their slogan. But it connects back to what they stand for, right? The fresh food delivered to your door, but also that enemy of what you shouldn't do. Feed your dog processed burnt brown balls for every meal.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked a lot about consumer brands, but you did mention one in B2B space. What do brands that have a more business to business focus or a business consideration, what lessons should they take from some of these really powerful consumer stories?
Well, I do think what are you going to say no to is a very important question to ask. And too many times, particularly in business to business, I mean, they're customer focused. We just want to make the customer happy. Whatever
Right.
the customer wants, we'll give it to them. Sometimes the best way is to draw that line in the sand. What are you not going to offer? Right?
Right.
For
Right.
Southworks, it was no contracts. Forget it. We're just going to do it on demand. But one of the greatest examples of using a strategic enemy was Salesforce, the
Mm,
first CRM in the cloud. Now, initially, cloud was small, right? But of course, they were the pioneer. They saw the future, and they strongly positioned against the enemy no software, the end of
mm,
software. They
mhm.
protested Oracle events. They had all sorts of crazy, talk but it was a powerful position to not just talk about you, but what are we fighting against? All the problems of software. Instead of, most companies would try to do both, right? We got software customers now, but we'll just add a little cloud. The better strategy is go all in on the cloud. I mean, that's what NVIDIA's done with AI. Of course, they were initially the premier, and they still are the premier graphics, chip for video games, but they refocused just
Mm,
on AI. And while they still do the graphics cards, all of their time, all of their, major attention and PR and effort has been in the AI space, which, as the pioneer and going in
right.
early and standing for that has been a very strong driver. So, you know, being, dominating a category is very important, but particularly, if you're in B2B, what are we going to say no to? What can we say that we are for by,
Right.
strongly showing what we're against?
Now, one of the things that I think comes through loud and clear as you're talking about the brands is this notion of also understanding your purpose.
Mhm.
So, how should purpose be a part of a brand's true strategy?
Here's the thing. I think, purpose is very important for the company itself, right?
Mhm.
For, the mission of the company, for the employees. It's not always that important for the consumer, depending on
Mhm.
the company, right? If you're working with LinkedIn, what's the real strong purpose, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're going to connect people and be the business, social media company. But I don't think the consumer is thinking so much about the purpose. But it is important because in many cases, it can drive also the strategy. So you think about Dove, its Real Beauty campaign, right? There was deep purpose in there and redefining beauty standards about being more open, being more inclusive. And so in those cases, absolutely purpose comes to play, a deep role in the entire strategy, both for the company as well as the end consumer.
Right. And it's interesting. We talked about that, whether the consumers care about it, but they care about the actions of the brand and the
Yeah.
customer. So when we think about it in many ways, if the staff internalizes the purpose, then the strategy becomes an extension of that, right?
And that's why it is so important for the company itself to own that purpose, understand that purpose, and more importantly, to live that purpose. Because I
Right.
think it will lead to making the right decisions on strategy, on what to say no to. It sets up, those guardrails to say, of what we should be doing and
Right.
clearly what we should not be doing. Chick-fil-A is another great one, which I think has greatly, internalized it. But, they also have the cows saying, eat more chicken.
Right.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, you want a chicken sandwich, but they are closed on Sunday, which, I think that scarcity sometimes drives you to want things more, doesn't it? I
Right.
mean, my son is obsessed with Chick-fil-A and like, we're always like, what day is it? Like Saturday? Like we better go twice because it's not going to
Right.
be open tomorrow.
It's something that you really want, but now it's being taken away, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, trying instead of being so customer, whatever
Yes.
the customer wants, be competitor focused. How are we going to differentiate from our competitors? For Chick-fil-A, they don't sell hamburgers, right? That allows them to hone in on their focus.
So I'm going to give you a chance to go back and think about this. I'm just going to give you 4 words:
Mm.
advertising, PR, brands, boardroom.
Well,
So,
those are some of my books.
yes. So
uh,
you think about it, you had 22 laws of branding
yeah.
and you talk about the rise and fall, the fall of
Fall of
everything.
advertising and the rise of PR.
Let's talk a bit about that. We've been a little bit on branding, but what do you think today about advertising and its nexus with PR?
Well, the title of the book was very provocative, of course, because that
Right.
that makes a very good book title. But the actual book itself, we're not negative on advertising and say it's never good. In fact, it's incredibly important, but not to launch new brands. And that's the difference.
Mhm.
And that's the same today. You need to launch brands with something that's credible. And what you say about yourself, not credible, not believable. And they're not even going to stop to pay attention from advertising from a brand, they've never heard of with a
Right.
message they don't understand or, haven't heard before. Advertising is best used to repeat something that people already believe, to
Right.
remind them of it, to, keep the noise up about your brand, keep the, your Coca-Cola
Right.
bottle out there, your, Clydesdale, if you're Budweiser, those iconic ideas to blast the world with them. But, absolutely today it's same is true that the PR word of mouth is what is the biggest driver. And, social media, sure. But now, with these influencers, people are wising up to these people being paid.
Right. Right. So
Right.
true.
And it really, I like to say there's a spectrum in advertising on one end and PR on the other. And, you find things along the
Right.
spectrum, if you will, versus, your friend who you trust, telling you to use this brand. Well, that's like, score
Right.
100 on the PR versus, a Super Bowl ad, which
Right.
is, at the other end of the spectrum.
Well, what's interesting is we go down that continuum. It's the PR stage of the continuum that's informing the algorithms today.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, you're going to see a better AI engagement in search off of some of the earned media on the PR side than you would on your traditional ad spaces.
Well, and that is a very interesting point in changing, how, the dominance of search where you could,
Yeah.
you could pay to be at the top and it got real messy real quick the past few years. And now AI being able to kind of cut through the clutter on it and get to and use those most credible sources out there that are, independent voices and, gathering all that data to give you a clearer picture and the real truth. And here's the thing. What's very helpful about the strategic enemy is this idea of people like a good debate. I call these, the big brand debates. That is what gets people talking, gets people to, pick a side, right? If, either you're a Mac person or a PC person, you're a Starbucks person or a Dunkin' person. And these drive a lot of the talk and
Mhm.
also people, in the word of mouth or on the Reddit boards of, defending or promoting
Right.
whatever side they're on. There's no one side for everyone. There's Crumble and there's Mrs. Fields. I mean, there's Shopify or there's Amazon. There's multiple ways for
Right.
merchants to go on. And so being one of those top two brands that are, diametrically opposed is
Mhm.
that's the place to be. And that's what, is the strong building of brands for companies.
So one of the things you talk about a lot is the fundamental principles of positioning, right?
Sure.
The fundamentals. And we were talking earlier about just the amount of travel we end up doing and your proximity to the largest airport in the world, right?
That's right.
And so your reward for that is you've traveled to over 60 countries.
I have. I
And,
have.
which is amazing in the work that you're doing. What commonalities do you see in counseling business leaders across the globe on these fundamental principles of positioning?
The minds are the same. I mean, what's interesting is that we have so many shared experiences now. I mean, first there was, television and then, cable and now the internet. I mean, which brings us so close together that we all have these, you know, shared movie experiences, shared experiences with McDonald's, Coke, Microsoft, iPhone. They're all over the world. And so there's tremendous power in building global brands. And they're not all from the US. I just happen to name some. I mean, there's, IKEA and there's Aura Ring and there's Spotify and there Ely. I mean, they're all over the world. The opportunity is truly great. What's interesting though is when you go to smaller countries, they often don't appreciate their ability to build a global brand. Yet there is so much potential. And what you do need to do is narrow the focus. See, in a small
Mm.
country, it's a little like a small town. What do you find? You find
Mhm.
companies that are into everything.
Right.
Because of the size, they tend to be less focused. Yet when you go global, narrowing the focus even more is essential. And that's
Mhm.
one mistake that, companies can make in trying to go global with too many things. I mean, back in the day, Nokia was a company that made everything. But when
Right.
they went global, they did it with just one product, and that was cell phones.
Just focusing on just one. So
Yeah.
you talked about that you see products and brands coming in there. What's one positioning story you can share with me from outside of the US that really informs your thoughts today? What's one kind of breakthrough that you've seen with a global brand?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I've been to so many countries is because positioning is such a big idea around the globe.
Mhm.
It's the powerful way of building brands, and that book has opened a lot of doors and allowed for the opportunities to speak and work with clients. One of which was a fan. He had a small dairy company in India,
Okay.
and he had my dad and I fly over there to work with him and his team, and they were selling, milk. They don't have them in containers. They're like little plastic bags, and they would sell them in these little kiosks and they wanted to position, sell more milk, right?
Right.
And so he's like, our milk is better. Okay, well, how are we going to communicate that? And he's like, oh, people, they even water it down. It's so good. And we're, getting them to talk and talk. And what happened is his milk had more fat than the other milks. Now in
Okay.
India, people are looking for more fat. Fat's good, right? Calories are good. So instead of trying to, find a slogan or a way to communicate that, we said, put on big number on the front of the package, the percentage. I can't exactly, it was like 5% or 4 point something percent, which will instantly show, how much is in yours compared to the competitors. And that
Mm.
idea took off like crazy. In fact,
Mhm.
the best part of the story is, we gave him the idea, worked on the strategy, flew home, and, he called us back a few months later and he said, listen, I thought it was a crazy idea, and but I paid you guys all that money, and you flew all the way here, and I figured I'd just try it, and it was
Right.
so successful. He became a $1 billion company, one of the richest men in India, as a matter of
Right.
fact. But a simple idea of a way to visually communicate, against your enemies out there, right? Of
Mhm.
what made your brand better by showing how it was different. Because that's
Mhm.
the thing. At the end of the day, yes, it was perceived as better, but not by saying I'm better, but by showing what that contrasting to the
Right.
other brands that had less fat.
Really powerful. When you think about the book, Your 22 Laws, is there one law that kind of rises to the top today? that you thought was important when you wrote the book, but you're really realizing it's important today?
Yeah, it does come down to one principle and one word, and that's focus.
Mm,
Without a focus, positioning isn't possible. Finding a strategic enemy isn't possible.
mm,
Finding a visual hammer isn't possible. Your PR strategy isn't possible. Without a focus, none of it is possible. So, companies have to, first and foremost, find that focus. And the honest truth is, most entrepreneurs do. They do start with a narrow focus, like
right,
dude wipes, right? I mean, they're scrappy entrepreneurs. We got one idea. We're going to make some dude wipes. Here's what happens: you get a little success, and that
right.
little success goes to your head. And that's what happened to Sean Riley at Dude Wipes. And in 2019, he had the big idea. He says, why stop at wipes? People love these. Our customers love them. We want to be the dude nation. We want to take over the bathroom. We're going to launch dude deodorant and dude soaps and dude everything. Well, isn't that what a lot of companies do? And he
Mm,
did. He got those products out to the market. And then, as he tells me, he read the book, The 22 Immutable Laws, and he said, and I quote, "Oh shit, I'm breaking the law of line extension." And he shut those businesses down. And believe me, it was just in time as the pandemic hit. We were buying any kind of toilet paper on the shelf, wet, dry, it didn't matter. And a lot of
okay.
people discovered Dude Wipes. And here's the thing: the resources, money is a big resource, but your time is the most valuable. And because he got out of those distracting line extensions, he had all the time and resources to ramp up production, to ramp up the marketing, and really become a dominant brand and own this category in the mind. And we see the fantastic success because of that dedication to focus and building that brand. And so remembering that, and not
Mm,
only that, you see the big companies, you see the headlines, you know what I mean? They're
right,
always, going back to the basics. What does that mean? Back to their focus, back to what
right,
built the brand. Nike going back to their athletes, right? Starbucks going back to coffee. I mean, the
right.
headlines are all the same because they get distracted with the, trying to be
Yeah.
everything to everybody instead of what do we really own? What do we stand out for? And how do we keep repeat, repeat, repeat?
I remember Lego having a similar conversation. They went back to the brick
Yeah.
and the figure. They're like, we're about these two things. We started with the brick and we evolved to the minifigure, and they
Mhm.
shut off everything else and kind of regrouped back to that space.
And became more successful than
Right.
ever. They went from the brink of bankruptcy to more successful than ever. I mean, that is, again, such a powerful idea of, and listen, it's not easy to build those things, but that's the
Yeah.
power. That's what makes them different. Those little darn bricks that, but what a key to imagination and way for,
Right.
to give children that opportunity to not have them everything handed to them, but to make them build it themselves. It's a very powerful thing to be.
So we're going to continue with this, conversation of finding your enemy. I'm curious about the war in the boardroom.
Mm.
That was one space I wasn't as familiar with as we were going into this conversation. So let's talk. As a person that spends a lot of time in boardrooms, let's.
Well, yeah, the war in the boardroom, and it was really about the mindset of management versus marketing. And
Mhm, mhm,
it really, you think about analytical left brain type management people, right? They're good with people, they're good with numbers. And then you've got, more right brain creative marketing people, and, how they approach and see the world in different ways, and some of the fundamental differences where management is all about, reality, the reality of the numbers, the reality of the product or service, where marketing understands that it's not about reality, it's about the perception. The perception matters most.
right.
And so, the book is all set up with these, contradictory ideas of how people, have preconceived notions to, marketing thinks in visuals, management thinks in words, and visuals are tremendously powerful. And these different ideas. And at the end of the day, and one of the reasons we wrote the book is because we argued with a lot of executives over the years to, put in place these kind of positioning ideas. And so to get through to them and to understand and have them understand, it is talking through it and understanding, the importance of things like perception.
Strategic enemy. Is the enemy ever within?
It absolutely is within in many companies. And that's what I've talked about in terms of line extension. I mean, when you do that, you become your own worst enemy. Instead of, giving what I say is the better alternative is giving birth to your own enemy. So you have the example of, what did the Gap do? One of the greatest things they ever did was launch Old Navy. Initially, they thought about calling it Gap Warehouse, but that would have been a disaster. You have the regular Gap and Gap Warehouse, right? One's too cheap and one's too expensive. Instead, Old Navy was able to define that category of, fashionable, inexpensive clothing and, was one of the first and pioneers. So such a strong strategy. So
and the generative style loop, right? Because we go from parents who have Gap kids, you grow into Old Navy, then you're all about the Gap, and then then we're sophisticated and we become Banana Republic. And we're back at Gap kids again.
And you're going to work out at the Athleta and all these.
Yes.
The powers in multiple brands. I mean, think about even, Apple, its greatest success is not because, obviously the Apple company and logo spans across all the different brands, but it's different brands, each named for the different categories that they are in. For example, you have the Macintosh, right? They went from the Apple II to the Macintosh because it was another type category of computer. Then they had the iPod, right? The first hard drive music player. Such a perfect example of leveraging the strategic enemy, which was those cheap flash drives, right? They could only hold 10 or 20 songs. What did iPod have? 1,000 songs in your pocket. The ability to oversimplify your message in that way to make it memorable and distinctive, so incredibly powerful. And then they came up with the iPad and, of course, as we all know, the iPhone, which was the first, they gave it a great category name, the first smartphone. What did that do? Instantly repositioned all the other phones as dumb.
Right.
And words and category names are incredibly powerful, and you set them up to make your category new and in a new way and new light.
So I'm going to ask a provocative question for you here. How would you create a recategorization of marketing and marketers? If you were to look at today's at the marketing leader of 2026.
Yeah. Well, Well, marketing is too important to be left to the marketing department. Marketing is, so essential to the entire company. I mean, as marketers, we need to rise to the very top of the company. I mean, many of the best companies are run by people that truly understand marketing at its core. I mean, you think back to, of course, Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos and others, but I mean, it is so incredibly important. Everyone needs to understand marketing because, that was a little bit, the war in the boardroom and marketing versus management. Everyone needs to understand why these types of strategies work, why focus is so important, what positioning is about. And when they understand why, it gets them out there to energize, to go ahead and, follow the advice, follow the strategy, stick to the focus. And, that's very, very important.
If you had one other piece of advice for strategic-minded marketing leaders who are looking to break through, brand small or large, what would it be?
There's so much. Instead of thinking about who you are, first think about what you're not.
There it is. What an incredible note to end on, my friend. Thank you. I can't believe that we've gone by this quickly, talking about the strategic enemy and focus and understanding who you are and as you put it, most importantly, what you're not. So as you lead brands, as you listen to and expand in the world, we encourage you to check out a lot of the work that Laura's done over the years that really help us think more strategically and more dynamically about brand positioning and the power of it all. Thank you, Laura, for being here, and thank you for taking us through the strategic enemy.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us for this provocative and intriguing episode of AMA's Marketing Ed. I'm your host, Bennie F. Johnson, and we encourage you to check out Laura's latest book, The Strategic Enemy, and to explore the offerings and programming of the American Marketing Association. Thank you.